Greetings from the captivating world of Paranormal M, where the extraordinary is our everyday. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications to never miss out on our thought-provoking stories. We hope you'll leave a like, and more importantly, a comment to help us along with this algorithm. We hope you're ready to be transported into a world beyond your wildest dreams. The Jealous Twin. My distant relatives, let's call him Nick, mother's mother, Nick's grandmother, and let's call Rita, had an identical twin sister, let's call her Melanie. Okay, so Nick's grandmother got married and bore kids while her twin sister Melanie had to face a tragedy early into her own marriage. This is where her husband succumbed to an illness. Shocked and in a sadness of what had become of her, Melanie decided to spend her life in isolation and in mourning of her late husband. Out of love for her sister, Rita invited her sister Melanie to stay with their family, looking after Rita's children in an attempt to get her out of mourning. But till both of the twin sisters reached old age, Melanie continued her life in mourning. Early on to Melanie's stay with her twin sister Rita, jealousy was apparent to everyone else in the family, especially around Rita's children. But out of respect to Rita, who was a good wife and a beloved mother and a caring sister, everyone else let Melanie's jealousy pass unnoticed. Though Melanie never made her jealousy noticeable to a great extent, her mannerisms and mild outbursts and shrewd comments around the household made it apparent to everyone who could connect the dots. Time passed by, and at the age of 70, Melanie, the jealous sister, passed away from sickness, and Rita, who was always a good sister to Melanie, mourned her sister's death. Melanie's cold corpse was brought after it was dressed and embalmed into the house she shared with Rita throughout the years, and was put on display for a few days till her last rites were conducted for all their relatives to pay their last respects, as per the customs of Sri Lanka. By this time, Rita bore 2 children, Nick's mother and a son who had migrated abroad. And Nick's mother and her husband had Nick and Nick's sister, who were around 16 years old and 15 years old respectively. During the period paranormal events took place in their home. It is customary in Sri Lanka that a corpse is not to be left alone during the display in the house. And hence during the night time, when all was quiet, and when all visitors had left, Nick and some of his friends and neighbors were left to accompany the corpse. It was past midnight, and most of Nick's friends had fallen asleep, and only a few of the neighbors were awake, but barely. While Nick brushed off his tired eyes and looked at the casket his second grandma laid there, he noticed that the corpse was illuminating bright colors off the corpse's facial area, which was odd to Nick. His first impression was maybe he was hallucinating things. Maybe it was owed to him being awake all night long, but out of curiosity, Nick turned off the lights, or at least the lights that illuminated the open living room where the corpse was laid, and to his dismay, he still saw a blue and red aura illuminating from the corpse's face. Nick was initially baffled, took a step back and went straight towards one of his good friends who was fast asleep in the chair. Woke him up and explained to him what he saw. Both of them went toward the corpse. Nick asked whether his friend could see the aura coming off of the face of Melanie's corpse. The friend couldn't see neither a light nor any aura. The last rites for Melanie were carried out a few days after the incident, and her corpse was cremated, and the twin sister Rita wept out of sorrow for her sister, and the rest of the family bore a sigh of relief knowing how jealous Melanie was about Rita and her happy family. A few days passed without incident, and one day Rita suddenly took a tumble down the stairs, but she was unharmed and left her with only a sore back, which is a bit astonishing to her age. But suddenly all family members, including Nick's mother, father Nick, and his sister, all felt as if someone was, or something, was pulling on their legs while climbing up the stairs at times. Eventually, Rita fell from the stairs for the second time, and this time the injuries sustained to her back were a bit severe, more so than previous, and it led to her being bedridden. Rita was adamant in telling everyone that she felt something grabbing her leg and pulling at it while climbing up the stairs. And that was what made her fall, and everyone in the family believed her story, even if no one dared to approve aloud what she stated. Another few days passed, and Rita's condition was getting worse. She couldn't eat, couldn't drink, or sleep properly. She always complained of chest pains and stated that she feels as if someone was pressing on her chest, slowly trying to suffocate her out of her breath. And one night while everyone was fast asleep, Nick's sister screamed out in horror, "It's Melanie! Grandma, help!" Nick and everyone rushed to Nick's sister's room as soon as they heard her screams. Nick's sister, who was asleep, was woken up by a faint cold chill passing through her face, and when she opened her eyes, she had seen a figure like Rita, her grandmother, standing at the foot of the door of her room. She had first cried out, "Grandma, are you okay? What are you doing out of bed?" And when hearing the call, the figure had lunged out at Nick's sister, trying to grab her throat. She had then realized that it was not her grandmother Rita, but a figure similar to Melanie, the twin sister of Rita, dressed in all white but her face glowing in a blue and red aura, similar to what Nick had observed on Melanie's corpse. And suddenly, when everybody rushed in, the figure had disappeared from Nick's sister's bedroom. While Nick's mother stayed with Nick's sister to calm her down, Nick and Nick's father had gone to Rita's bedroom to check on her condition. When they entered her bedroom, Rita was struggling for breath, putting every sap of effort left in her breath while trying to fend off something invisible from her chest. Both Nick and Nick's father gave their maximum effort to calm Rita down, but it was apparent that Rita was in a fight for her own with something invisible which was out to get her. The family brought their own doctors, who stated that there's nothing physically wrong with Rita, and even carried out blessings, both Buddhist and Catholic. But Rita showed no progress in her condition, and her night terrors and attacks from the invisible entity didn't seem to stop. A few days later, Rita passed away, but acts of the invisible entity didn't seem to stop. Mind where you let your children play. A little girl is crying beside a rundown and abandoned house, surrounded by a short wall which is on the brink of collapse. Passerbys look at the little girl who's crying, but move along, assuming that her parents must be close by. The house has its own intriguing backstory as to its nature of deterioration and abandonment in an area of the city where the value of the land and the overall property is not ignored real estate agents. But that, of course, is a story for another day. The little girl lives 2 houses down the same lane where the abandoned house lies in wait. But many little children in the neighborhood stay away from the spacious garden of the abandoned house, except for the little girl, who was shown quite a keen interest on playing pretend in the garden area of this abandoned property. The garden is a pitch of rough soil with faint patches of grass, but besides the rough pitch of soil that makes the footpath that leads to the front door to the abandoned house, Many bushes have overgrown their intended range due to being neglected. Neighbors of the family of the little girl have given warnings to the parents to not allow the little girl to play in that abandoned property, citing incidents and the neighborhood talk about the property being haunted or the place being possessed by the old woman who loved and died in the property. But those warnings were met mostly with humor and disbelief by these parents. The parents were hardworking folk who had to grind their way through life to earn an earnest living. The father was a typical government agent who worked from 8 to 5 daily on minimum wage, and the mother did day-to-day chores to earn. Evidently, where their little child played in her free time was not much of a concern for the parents as long as she stayed in the neighborhood, where others more concerned about the child's safety had their eyes on her. The little child was seen to make conversation with somebody during her playtime, and this was often seen as cute rather than weird by everyone, including the parents of the little girl. But one day, all was about to change. On the day of the incident, the little girl was seen crying in the middle of the rough soil patch on the property for all to see, and ignored by many as always, assuming that she must have cut herself on one of the overgrown bushes or such a little child when playing in the dirt. But one concerned woman in the neighborhood noticed a black patch on the back of the neck of this little girl. Concerned, she called out to the mother of the girl, and both of them went in to pick her up. The mother of the girl and the concerned woman were shocked when they saw in detail what the black patch on the back of the little girl was. The black patch was an imprint of a palm from a hand of a human. The patch had an eerie feel to it, and was more inhuman. When the two women inquired whether somebody hit the girl on the back, what she said terrified the two women even further. The little girl said the old lady who used to watch her in the garden while she played had become furious with her when the little girl refused to go inside the abandoned house with the old lady. When the two women asked to describe the old lady's appearance, the little girl's description of the old lady matched the looks of the old lady who lived and died in the property way before the little girl was even born. So, dear parents, be aware of where your little children play. I've done a little digging into the history of this abandoned house. I described it. It's both tragic and horrific. Let me know if you need the story to be written. I'll not publish any authentic pictures of the site owing to concerns regarding privacy of the family. I used to live across the street from this house, and my parents never let me close to the property. On that day when the story spread across the neighborhood, I was grateful for my parents. The little girl in the story might well past her teen ages now. I actually saw the Grim Reaper. This happened when I was just a kid of 9 or 10. It sounds like some made-up story. It really happened. This is my first time revealing it since the day it happened. I was a farm kid that grew up doing chores, helping out on the farm. If you know anything about farming, you know hay baling time is an all-hands-in time. You're bucking bales in the field and choking in the hayloft. You're doing all of this some of the hottest days of the year. After a long day of putting up bales and being covered in sweat, hay sticking to us and in our mouths and noses full of hay, it was finally done. Being true country kids, when that last bale hit the hayloft, my siblings and I ran toward the pond like it was an oasis in the desert. We hit the cool water full tilt. Our pond was spring-fed by an underground river, so that water was always around 60 degrees. We were all splashing around, acting like the fools that we were, just enjoying getting the sweat and hay off of us. All of a sudden, to my mind, everything froze. It was as if time stopped. There was no sound. The shouts and laughter had stopped. I could move my eyes, but not my head. I glanced around as much as possible. I saw my brother doing a cannonball from the shore. He froze just as his lower half had entered the water. I could see the water bursting around him. It was frozen mid-air. I could see his happiness in his face. I could see my older brother stepping up onto the shore, the water dripping from his frozen body in mid-air. Just beyond my brother standing on the shore was a robed figure holding a sickle. Beside him was an old man that looked a lot like my dad. The old man was using a walker or two canes. I honestly don't remember which. There was something so familiar yet different about this old man. I looked closer. The old man did resemble my dad, but it wasn't my dad. The old man was talking to the figure in the dark robe and looking at me. I have no idea what was being said because, in all honesty, I was freaking out in my head. Time has stopped, and there were these two figures standing at the bank of the pond. One definitely looked like the Grim Reaper, and I'm acutely aware of them. At that very instant, I sensed the old man was trying to decide if he could jump into my body fast enough to escape his guardian. I also knew he decided not to try. The very next instant, they disappeared, and the world started again. I'm freaking asking my brothers what just happened. I explain that time just froze. I tell them about the two figures on the shore. They look at me with that look that brothers give each other when they think the other is nuts. I never mentioned this again to anyone. It's now almost 50 years later. Guess what? I look like my dad did. I also have severe neuropathy in both legs, and now should be using a cane or a walker. I'll let you guess who flat out refuses to use a cane or walker no matter how bad the pain is. I now know the second figure on the shore was me as an old man. I now know the Grim Reaper was reviewing my life with me. I only know for that one moment in time, young me and old me were aware of each other. That's why I knew what that old guy was thinking. I also know old me didn't want to deprive young me of my future by trying to jump into my body. I think when the time comes and current me is on that shore looking at young me, I hope I'm smart enough to tell myself to buy Microsoft and Amazon stock. I know most will think this is made up. I assure you it really happened. I saw my future self standing beside the Grim Reaper, watching my younger self. "10 years since one of the scariest things that happened to me. But I feel like telling one specific story right now, because today is the 10th anniversary of the event. So 10 years ago, I was still living with my parents in my childhood home. So on this day, it was in the afternoon. There was a small house fire in our next-door neighbor's house. There was no chance of it spreading, so I was in the bathroom getting ready for work. I suddenly hear my dad call my name. And I went to go look for him, realizing that the house was empty and my dad was across the street outside looking at the fire. This scared me so bad that whatever was in the house knew my name and could mimic my father. But then after talking about it with my mom, we realized that something like this happened before. My grandma used to live with us, And the one time she got so mad saying my mom was calling her name, my mom wasn't. Mimicker strikes again. So a few months back, I shared some stories about my parents' haunted house. There are dozens of stories from over the years, but I shared how there seems to be something that impersonates different members of my family. It first happened years ago, when my grandmother lived with my parents. One time my grandma got furious with my mom. She said my mom had been calling for her from the front of the house and hadn't responded when my grandma called back. The next time something similar happened, and it happened to me. I was in my bathroom getting ready and I heard my dad call my name from in front of the house. I called back and immediately went searching for him. He was outside across the street talking to neighbors. It really freaked me out at that time because it sounded just like my dad and it said my name. Tonight, whatever this is, struck again. My dad swears that he heard my mom calling from outside, only to discover right afterwards that she was inside. He's the biggest skeptic of the family, and I think it gives credibility that 3 people have experienced something very similar. Would love to get everyone's opinion on what it was. A moment that recurs frequently. I have this memory that keeps coming back, and I believe that on that day something could have happened that didn't. Let me explain. I was young, and we would often go fishing near the canal for fun. While walking along the canal, we found a place with a metal bridge. And below there was a drop of at least 30 meters with large fish swimming. We settled there and tried to catch one. But for a reason I don't understand, we decided to cross the bridge from the wrong side. So, I was hanging on with my back facing the void. When we reached the middle of the bridge, I had a flash of falling, and I no longer had the strength to continue to the end. So I told my friend that we needed to turn back. But he didn't understand why we would turn back when we were still halfway of the path to go. Nevertheless, he listened to me. And sometimes, even today, I dream of that particular moment with the feeling that I made the right choice. Because I had a bad premonition. Seems like my soul is trying to remind me of that moment. Perhaps because I made a decision that may have saved my life. In the end, my body or my soul still connects me to that specific moment in history, so that I remember it. Why? I think my house was haunted. There are a series of events in my childhood home, mostly at night. I'll name a few. I was once going downstairs at around 1 a.m. Everyone was asleep except me. I woke up for a drink, went downstairs, opened the fridge, and while I was holding the fridge open and laid my phone with the flash on the table, I felt something grabbing my hand, like the actual touch. I look while I pull away and nothing. Got incredibly scared though, and I was sure that my brain wasn't playing tricks or anything. I was so sure that I ran upstairs and left my phone there. Another one was when I was much younger, around 1 a.m. Also, me and my twin sister were up and the door was directly facing the bed. We were playing on our bed and the lights all out, everyone asleep. Light goes on and we see a shadow directly under the door. We think it's our parents. The light goes out, we take a slight peek, our tablets in our hands with the flash, and there's no sound or anyone leaving or even in the house. And we also could hear sounds downstairs, quite a bit at night. Our parents never had any of this. When we asked them about it, they never knew anything about who or what was downstairs. My sister could hear it. These are the more major ones. We don't have any signs of them anymore. Also had quite a bit of nightmares. Am I being followed or targeted by a demon? Not safe for work warning. You've been warned. I, a 27-year-old female, and my husband, a 28-year-old male, have moved from Florida to Georgia. He's lived in here before. I, however, am new to this area. Well, let's just jump in. So my husband and I work at the same facility. We drive into work and home together. Anyway, we both have noticed on our way home on nights that we've been out a little bit later than normal. And the sun's already gone down once we turn onto one specific road that we can't avoid. We turn onto this road and it always seems like the world gets darker. Even if it's pitch black outside, it gets darker. The first time my husband noticed this, he immediately said something about it. This has happened every single time that we've gone down this road. Tonight was a little bit scarier than normal on a ride home. We had about 2.4 miles left on the road, and my husband said, "What the fuck is that standing in the middle of that field?" I turned to look, and all I could see was a dark figure off in the distance. This was extremely confusing considering how dark it was. But this figure was darker than the surrounding landscape. Immediately, I felt even more uneasy and got the feeling that it was just waiting for someone to mess up. Just waiting, watching, wanting. I told my husband and I was telling him about the feeling. It began to speed up. And then he put his arm over my chest, covered the right side of my face, and told me not to look back. Then after about a minute, he told me to focus on the map and give him play-by-plays. During this, my husband, who's a very stoic man, was panicking. I could hear it in his voice. He just kept repeating, "Look at the map. Don't look up. You're safe." During this, I started feeling a burning sensation in my right forearm. I told him my arm was burning, then opened the mirror light to look at my arm and was flabbergasted when I saw 3 red scratches running from my wrist to my inner elbow. This was disconcerting, knowing that I didn't cause the scratch. I bite my nails, so I don't even have enough nails to cause a scratch. After seeing this, I immediately called attention to it, and my husband turned pale. Honestly, the next 3 or 4 minutes were a blur. He got us to the end of that road, turned off, hightailed it back to our house. We turned onto our road, and I started to calm down. My husband kept saying, "You didn't see anything, and it's okay." Then we turned into our driveway, and my chest felt like it was ripped open. After getting into the house and into our room, I took my shirt off, and I found 3 more scratches across my heart. I turned around to look at my husband, and he was standing there in shock. I had 3 sets of 3 scratches on my chest and back. Long story short, we're terrified. Is someone or something attempting to attach themselves to us? What can we do to prevent it? Also, this is one of our main commute roads. We can't avoid it without adding a 20-plus minute to our drive. I think my dad came to visit me the night following his death. NSFW/trigger warning. My dad died on September 1st, 2019. Yep, this was 4 years ago. But I've only ever shared this with a handful of people since then. Since his death was extremely traumatic for me, Those aren't the details we're here for, though. My sister, my mom, and myself stayed up until 3 or 4 a.m. that night. We were so numb and replaying the day's events in our heads to the point where we were no longer talking to each other and just staring into space. Eventually, I snapped out of it and quietly said, "I'm going to try to get some sleep. You guys should too." My mom went to bed not long after. I think my sister crashed on the couch. It was very chilling for me to just walk to the room that I'd been staying in. My dad, my mom, and myself had just moved to Texas and were staying with my sister until we found a place. He died in the foyer connecting the hallway to the bedroom. I slumped myself into my air mattress and laid for a while until I eventually fell asleep. It wasn't really a normal sleep, though. I was asleep, but was still aware of what was going on outside of my slumber, as if I were awake. I wasn't dreaming. My brain was blank. I felt something touch my shoulder, shook it off, assuming it was the blanket bunched up too far. Then I felt the weight again, and felt a full hand on my shoulder. Then it suddenly started to shake me. I woke up and turned and said, "What?" Silence. I was sharing a room with my niece at the time, but she was staying over at a friend's house and the room was pitch black and dead silent. You could probably have heard a pin drop even on that carpet. Didn't think much of it at the time. I was so exhausted. I'd assumed it was either my mom or sister just wanting someone to talk to. But after I got pure silence, I went back to sleep. I woke up at around 9 that morning and dragged myself off to a half-deflated bed at that point. I shuffled out of the room, through the cursed foyer, went to the back porch to sit. That's where I found my sister already awake and chain-smoking. We exchanged good mornings and briefly stated how in shock we each still were from yesterday's events. We sat for a few minutes in silence, and as I was preparing to ask her if she tried waking me up at some point in the night, she said, "I heard Dad this morning when I came out here. He said, 'I love you.' He had a nickname for me, too. He called her Babes, but it's far more embarrassing for mine." After she said that, I asked her, "Did you come in the room and try to wake me up for anything last night?" She gave me a funny look and said no. I shrugged it off and asked my mom later that morning. She also said no. I could be crazy, but I swear, someone touched me and woke me up. Was it my dad or just my imagination? Or just some kind of trauma response? I think my grandmother is watching over us. Me and my fiancé, 19 as well, we've been together for 4 years now. We also have 2 beautiful children together. In the year 2020, during the height of COVID, my grandmother passed away due to unrelated complications. She knew she wasn't doing well for a while and finally got her help. She had an infection in her bladder, which was basically killing her. So she had an emergency surgery. Only my mother, aunt, and grandfather were allowed to see her in the hospital. I still remember the last words that she said to me. They were, "See you later." She seemed to be getting better after surgery. Then she suddenly started getting worse again. She died peacefully in her sleep in the hospital, surrounded by my aunt, mother, and grandfather. My mother also recalled that when she passed away, birds flew by the window, sat by the window, and looked into the room. Fast forward to a couple of months later, and my fiancé, girlfriend at the time, told me that she was pregnant with our second child. This was scary, but also exciting for us. But I couldn't help but dread the thought that my grandmother wasn't around for it. Fast forward to July 2022, and it was my daughter's first birthday. Now to clarify, I'm personally not super religious at all. When it comes to God, heaven, and hell, I'm open to it. I see it as there may be such things as God, but maybe not. So I don't necessarily believe in those things straight up. But I'm also not against the idea of them. But when it comes to the paranormal, I am a believer. I believe that human spirits are able to stay on Earth after that day. I also believe in demons, but I don't necessarily think they're creatures from hell. I just see them as negative human spirits or negative non-human entities. My parents have a sort of shelving unit to keep all of my grandmother's dolls on, as well as some of her other belongings, as well as a picture of her. One of these belongings being a music-playing snow globe with a cardinal in it. The cardinal were my grandmother's favorite birds. We got it for her a couple of years back for Christmas before she passed. We've never touched it since putting it on that unit. Not at all whatsoever. So at this birthday party for my daughter, we all start to gather around the table to sing happy birthday. But then suddenly the snow globe up on the unit, which nobody has even been close to, starts playing music. Not everybody hears it at first. Only me and my fiancé really notice. Then it stops. Only a few seconds later it starts playing again. This time everybody can hear it. My family starts tearing up and even crying, believing that it's my grandmother. Even I start to tear up. I don't know if it was a coincidence or maybe some other random spirit, but it's hard not to believe that it was my grandmother. Perhaps saying hello and happy birthday to the great-granddaughter that she never met. I think something demonic was with my niece. Me, my fiancé, and our kids are currently living with their parents as we can't really afford a place of our own right now. About a year ago, her sister, as well as her 4 kids and husband, also lived with us. They honestly are not all that the greatest parents, you could say. They let their kids get away with anything. But when they started living here, that changed because none of us were going to be that way with them. I've been with my fiancée for 4 years now, and her nieces and nephews know me very well. They also refer to me as uncle at times. Their oldest daughter is 4, but was 3 at the time. Has always been a troublemaker. She still kinda is, but there came a period of time when they lived with us and she was awful, crazy, aggressive, super defiant. Not saying that she was or is possessed, but I do believe that at that time something was affecting her behavior negatively. A few other things were happening at that time. Our youngest daughter was still in the crib, slept in our room. I know that a sign of spirits or entities is cold spots. Her crib always seems to be cold, as well as the area around it in comparison to the rest of the room. She also had a period of time where she kept seemingly waking up in the middle of the night for no reason. It almost seemed like, in a way, somebody or something was annoying her or trying to play with her. My niece also kept talking about seeing a large man in the corner at night. Keep in mind, there was no furniture or toys or anything that could possibly be mistaken for a person. She would wake up screaming and terrified, refusing to go back to the bedroom, and she'd just point to that corner. Then her father spoke up and claimed to have seen a shadow figure himself multiple times in her bedroom. He tried to claim that it was possibly his grandfather that had recently passed away. I didn't say anything, but I know that it couldn't be true, mainly because shadow figures are often non-human entities, not friendly human spirits. And I personally also had one experience too. Here goes. One night I fell asleep on the couch in the basement, which isn't far from the kids' bedroom. I woke up seeing a young boy dressed in beaten and old clothes, almost as if he was homeless. He was maybe only a couple of centimeters away from my face. When I blinked, he went away. Our oldest also randomly started to say that she was seeing monsters at night, which she'd never said before. Me and my fiancé are not at all religious, but thought we'd give holy water a shot. It seemed to have stopped things, and nobody said anything since. They've also moved out since and have been on their own now for about 8 months. My first paranormal experience. I live in Oneida. It could be India, but it says Oneida. And yes, I know there are many stories about ghosts and gods. Bullshit. But I don't believe in any of them. I'm an atheist, so basically what happened actually scared me a bit. It was after about a month after my grandfather's death, and the room which he died was closed shut with lock for months with lights on, don't know why, and my whole family was gone for some ritual to their hometown. So it was me and my little cousin for the whole night. It's a 3 stories house, and pretty big for 2 people. So every night was going normally. We eat, clean, watch TV, with the grandfather's lights on, 24/7. But one night my cousin slept to his house because he had to do his homework, so I was all alone in the whole house. I woke up at 3 after hearing some noises that almost sounded like a bell. I was pretty sure it was the sound of an LPG cylinder striking against the wall. So I just sat on the bed to see what was happening. The cylinder was very heavy to be moved by a rat or wind. Another strange thing was that I couldn't see was the lights of my grandfather's room being reflected by the wall of the hall room. I could see it across the room every night, but tonight it was dark. We have inverter, and my room lamps were on, so it was unlikely that it was a power cut. Now I was crazy scared. I shoved my face into the blanket and started reading some hentai manga. Okay, naturally I couldn't sleep. A day after that incident, I got some health problem. My legs are always tired, always 24/7. They have energy, but they're super tired. It's been 3 years since that incident. Still the same. I need help. Any professionals here? You heard him, guys. Well, my friend's name is Dana, and strange things have been happening to her. The other day, she told me about a really weird and scary dream that she had. In the dream, she was called to go find something, but she didn't know what she was supposed to look for. Then a voice said, "Don't send her." And a demon appeared, biting her hand and scratching her. She said the pain felt so real that she still felt it the next day, even though there were no marks. She started praying, and the demon told her that praying wouldn't help. Then the dream shifted. She saw herself in the mirror, looking pale as if dead, with orange around her eyes and black eyes themselves. That's where the dream ended. She shared this dream with me, and I have some knowledge in the spiritual realm as I read tarot cards and cleanse energies. I explained to her about the energies in churches and suggested she do a cleansing. Today we went out for a meal. She told me that she couldn't sleep at night, feeling fear and panic. She heard noises and people talking and laughing. Her mom even mentioned that she had very dark eyes, although her eyes are hazel. I started to take it more seriously and asked her about it, but we got distracted. Then, at a restaurant, she began to feel unwell. She suddenly said, "It's here. I feel it's here." And she felt like vomiting. I sensed a dark and malevolent energy behind her, but didn't tell her to avoid scaring her. I tried to repel it with my own energy and thoughts, and it started to fade away, but we still felt its presence from a distance. While we were walking later, we felt someone was following us, and I remembered that her boyfriend's father's a priest who's performed several exorcisms. Is it possible that the demon seeks revenge for those exorcisms? I'm not sure. Weird things happen at this hotel. I work at a mediocre hotel in a random town in Ohio. It's not beautiful, historical, or massive. There's not really anything special about it. My coworkers joke around about it being haunted because there's one room that people get weird vibes in. And the old elevator most housekeepers use opens and closes slowly on its own at random times with no one in it. I personally have experienced some weird things that have convinced me that the hotel definitely has something weird going on inside of it. I haven't told my coworkers these stories, but I'm sure some of them know a few. My most unexplainable story that I haven't shared yet took place in room 217. I was in this person's room tidying things up while they were away at a meeting, and I instantly knew something was off. I thought I was just uncomfortable because the temperature was set to 90, but maybe it was something else. After I made sure there was no one in the room, I started making the bed. When that was done, I walked into the bathroom, bent down over the tub to grab a used washcloth. As I'm bent down, that's when an old lady said, "Thank you," clear as day, like she was right beside me. She said a couple more words after that, still clear as day, but for some reason I couldn't make out what she said. I instantly stood up without looking behind me. I walked right out of the room expecting to see an older woman standing in the doorway. Maybe she was thanking me for cleaning her room but didn't want to come in all the way. Nope. No one was there. Maybe she's in the hallway. Nope. I got spooked instantly and ran to the nearest housekeeping closet. I've gone over all the possibilities. Maybe the TV. Nope. The TV was on mute, and it was a man talking about the weather. Maybe it came from another room. Nope. I just went in all those rooms and everyone is away for a meeting. Did something play on my headphones? I wasn't wearing my headphones. None of it made sense, and I refused to go back to that room. Another thing that messes with my head is that many people have died in this hotel over the years. I had 2 people overdose in a room that I was scheduled to clean that day, and I know there's been more cases. I just wasn't in the room to hear about it. Weird thing is that I never saw the cops show up. Never heard any firemen. What happened to the bodies? It's unsettling. There's this college across the street that does events here multiple times a year. Apparently, at almost every event, one of the college freshman kids goes missing. This latest one was last seen exiting the building through the main lobby with nothing with him and getting into a car. He still to this day hasn't been found. He left all of his stuff in his room, didn't take his phone with him. It's all just unsettling, and I don't know what to make of it. The Haunting of the Bright House on Missouri Street. In my childhood, I had only one best friend. He was my friend from the time I was born, until life pulled us in separate directions at the end of our teenage years. Over the nearly 2 decades that our friendship lasted, we spent quite a bit of time in his house. His name is C.J. Bright, and this is the story of my experiences in his home. The haunting of the Bright house on Missouri Street. The first experience I ever had inside the house was in 2002, at the ripe age of 6. Rather tame as it was, every morning when I woke up in the living room, which we exclusively slept in, more on that later, I would venture into CJ's room to play some video games before he woke up. Without fail, each time I entered his room if the lights were out, I would see what appeared to be a young girl with long dark hair crying on his bed, with her head tucked into her knees. The image, likely shadowcast, always vanished as soon as the lights came on. Nevertheless, I dreaded seeing the girl each and every time. No matter how the bed was made or what junk lay on top, she was always there in the dark. I saw her every time I went into that room until I stopped going to the house entirely. To expand upon the earlier statement that we never slept in his room, that was his idea. He said he never slept well, and often would find himself waking up to the feeling of another presence in the room. From the time he can remember until the time we last spoke, he refused to sleep in his own room. CJ lived with his parents, Brian and Deborah Bright. The Bright family moved into that small house on the corner of Missouri Street before CJ was born, living in that house to this day. The strangest part of his room to me was always this one doll. The doll itself wasn't scary or disturbing in any way. In fact, it was a Homer Simpson plush. CJ oftentimes told me stories about how the doll would move around the room when he wasn't watching. I never experienced this firsthand, but I did see the eyes move, ever so slightly. Homer would be looking to the left, we would turn around or cut the lights off or on, and suddenly he'd be looking to the right. As a child, it was neat. The doll, strange as it was, never felt malicious. This experience only lasted until we last spoke, and resulted in the doll being duct taped to the ceiling. Stayed there for years, possibly still there to this day. Another strange event that occurred in the house involved a near full-bodied apparition. One day we sat in the living room about to watch When a Stranger Calls, 2006. And from the hallway a man came into view, turned towards us, waved, moved back from whence he came. This was interesting because the man was highly spectral, being quite transparent and without legs. Once his torso became his waist, his form turned into a sort of teal smoke. Not bright though, very, very, very dull. The room the man came out of, which must be passed through to reach CJ's room, will come into play later. Nothing is special about the room. It was an old lounge that had become a storage room, filled with miscellaneous junk in large plastic tubs. Another interesting thing about the man that we all saw wave at us was that he was Brian's grandfather. Incredibly, Brian received a phone call not an hour past the time we saw his grandfather, stating that the elderly man had passed away during an afternoon nap, merely an hour before the call was made. That wasn't the only spirit that was seen in that house either. However, it was the only kind one, as you may have guessed. More on that later. There were several orbs in the house, seen at random intervals, usually just fast enough to be in view before darting through a wall or door. I see quite a few orbs in the paranormal photos around the internet, but these orbs weren't small like ping pong balls. They were much larger. Not man-sized or anything quite that big, but around the size of a volleyball. I only remember one instance of the orbs doing anything significant, but it was quite significant indeed. Brian, the patriarch of the family, as previously stated, had one of his close friends over to visit and watch a movie with him. That man's name is Larry Vandershot. I was sat in the living room alongside CJ, Deborah, Brian, and Larry, and we were watching some recently released film on an old 60-inch square box television. Larry got up to use the restroom. This was down the hall in view of the living room that we were in. When he exited the restroom and began walking down the hall, an orb shot out of a storage room, which I mentioned earlier, and straight into his back. Larry became completely void of emotion and stood motionless. Unsure of what we had just seen, Brian beckoned him, telling him to return to the couch and continue the movie. Larry didn't respond. He stared blankly in our direction and began walking toward the living room. As he walked under the only light that illuminated the hallway, it went out. From the darkness, he continued walking towards us, shorting out the TV as he passed it on his way out. He walked by 2 lamps that went out as well. Eventually, he made it to the garage door that he used to leave the house entirely. We were dumbfounded. Any piece of technology Larry walked by was completely fried. He called the Brights' home telephone several hours later in a sobbing fit. He had forgotten everything. From his perspective, he was washing his hands and walking out of the restroom. Then, he was home. He said some of his lights had gone out and he couldn't explain anything. The Brights had to get new lamps and a new television, with the broken one sitting in their garage for many years until Brian sold it for parts. That brings us to the most disturbing encounter in this writing. This is the story of the other spirit, the most evil thing I've ever seen. To give you a perspective, these events unfolded over a series of years. Far gone was the 6-year-old from the first encounter. This last event was closer to 2009, when I was 13. On a normal weekend, not unlike others, I decided to visit. After a long day of video games, basketball, and the original trilogy on VHS, we unwound, putting on our pajamas and going to the living room to sleep like we did every time. Always the living room. We slept in there with Brian, who had fallen asleep while watching a movie. We always slept feet to head, with feet in front of CJ's mother's recliner. He slept by the coffee table that we scooted over to make extra room for ourselves. We bundled up with our individual blankets and drifted off to sleep. Then it started. I woke up in the night from a deep sleep and realized my friend had left. I was alone on the floor with Brian on the couch, gently snoring. I thought he might have gone to the restroom, but found it odd his pillow and blanket were gone. I went back to sleep. It seemed like no time had passed, and I woke up again, but this time I could see my friend. I thought it was CJ, but I soon realized it was something much worse. He was sat in the recliner at my feet, staring directly at me. He had an inhuman smile over his face, and his eyes appeared very dull, the irises almost non-existent. He smiled. He just smiled. I called to him, but he didn't respond. He didn't do anything but stare and smile. I was very frightened, throwing my small blanket over my face to hide from this thing. I tried going back to sleep, but of course I couldn't. Who could? I slowly lowered the blankets to see that he had moved from the recliner at my feet to a love seat at my left side. The love seat that sat in between 2 newly replaced lamps. He just stared and smiled. I felt such dread knowing I never felt a footstep. I began to tear up and covered my face once again, but only for a second, as I couldn't help myself. I peeked. He was now standing over me, 1 leg on each side of my body. He was bent over inches from my face, staring and smiling. I began sobbing and using my forearms, crawled from under him. I had to turn on the light. I had been to his house so many times before and I knew where the switch was, but in my panic I couldn't find it. He didn't move a muscle, remaining locked in place, but still staring. No matter where I moved, he still just stared into my eyes and smiled. I thought about Brian being right on the couch, so I screamed as loud as I can, "Turn on the light! Turn on the light! Turn on the light!" and continued until he got up and cut the light on. Complaining about being woken up from his sleep, he berated me and told me I should be asleep as well. All I cared about is that when he turned on the light, it vanished. That horrible, evil creature that had manifested itself as my best friend solely to hurt me was gone. I walked to his room, cut on the light, and played his PlayStation 2 until he woke up the next morning. I told him the story, expecting him not to believe me. I was wrong. What he told me gave me more insight into what really happened that night. He had been awoken too, but he saw me sleeping beside him. Then he heard a tapping. It went on and on and on until he located the source. In the kitchen, the Bright family had a giant sliding glass door that they kept locked at all times. They never bought curtains for it, but they had a fenced-in backyard, so no one really bothered them. At the very bottom of this door, protruding from the very earth, was a single hand tapping on the glass. It continued. Another broke out from the cement and began tapping too, then another and so on. All at once they stopped. Dozens of hands, complete with forearms coming from the ground, sat still. It was the calm before the storm. The hands began banging on the glass with such impact he described it as being able to feel it in his chest. Then flames began to lick at the door as he saw hell open up outside. The floorboards were swept on, began to rattle, and flames started shooting up from the cracks in the floor. Before long, boards were breaking off in the ground and hands were reaching through the inside of the house, clawing at anything they could grab. He saw pieces of furniture get dragged down into the fire. The hands got closer and closer. He remembered looking over at me, only to see that the hands were already wrapped around me, and I quickly became plunged into the flame. He stood up, grabbed his pillow and blanket, and darted into his parents' room where his mother was soundly sleeping. He shut the door and crawled in bed, afraid of what he had witnessed. He cried himself back to sleep and slept peacefully the rest of the night. I can only assume the sound of him running away is what woke me up. I'll never know for sure, but I do know it wasn't a nightmare. I've had nightmares, a lot of them. That was another being, a being of manipulation. I'm not sure what would have happened if Brian hadn't fallen asleep on the couch that night, but I'm fortunate he did, no matter how frustrated he was when I woke him. I never experienced much of anything else in the house, but CJ told me stories. Stories about long nights that we spent together hanging out like usual, without me ever coming over. He told me about one time we were standing in the kitchen enjoying 2 glasses of milk together, when Brian walked into the kitchen and asked, "Who are you talking to?" Only for CJ to look over and realize he was alone, holding 2 glasses of milk, both partially empty. His mother told mine about a time when she and Brian were arguing and he was trying to open the door to their room. Wouldn't budge. The knob would twist, but the door stayed closed. He yelled about her locking the door, and she yelled back about how it wasn't locked, until she cried herself to sleep. A few hours later, after Brian had calmed down, he tried the door once more, and it flew right open, revealing his wife asleep in their bed. I'm sure there are tales that remain untold about that house. I haven't been in several years now, really. CJ and I lost the spark that fueled our friendship. Eventually, we drift apart. Sometimes we see each other out in public and give a gentle nod and a wave. Not like when we hugged each other and when we were young and laughed our days away. Time changes everything, I suppose. But I'll always have the memories of that house. The good, the bad, and the Homer. Those certainly aren't the only paranormal experiences I've had, including a UFO sighting and a run-in with the poltergeist. However, the haunting of the bright house on Missouri Street will be stuck in my memory for a long, long time. My full-body apparition story. When I was around 12, 2008, 2009, my family, mother and father, and I went to visit some relatives, uncle, aunt, and cousin in rural Tennessee. We were all sat in the living room talking while the television played in the background. At some point, I went to use the restroom. Their restroom is situated to the left in a hallway past their kitchen. There's no doors directly adjacent to the restroom door. I had a tendency in my youth to open the bathroom door before washing my hands, as to not recontaminate my hands with germs when I exited the restroom. So I used the restroom, opened the door, and as I was washing my hands, I saw someone walking past the door in the corner of my eye. I feel it's important to note that the figure was moving in the opposite direction of the living room. The only rooms in the direction the figure was heading are 2 bedrooms of the house. Other than those rooms, the hallway's a dead end. I also feel it's important to note that I did not only see this figure in my peripheral vision, it was very slow moving, and the moment it caught my eye, I turned my head. Both eyes looked directly at the doorway. I saw the figure move past the center of the door frame until it was out of sight to the left. This figure never once acknowledged my presence, stopped walking, or made any noise. The best description I can give of the figure is that it was an elderly woman, hunched over. Not hunched over far, but in the way many elderly people walk without being able to straighten their backs. The figure was wearing a seafoam green nightgown that wasn't very saturated. A very light seafoam green, with an almost lacy mesh kind of transparency to it near the bottom of the dress. Enough so that I remember taking note of being able to see the legs moving. The figure wore very thick and rounded square glasses with a transparent brown frame. She had tight, curly, permed, likely graying brown hair that was holding on to its last of its color. She was also a bit overweight. I saw her vividly. There was no transparency to her at all, nor was anything off about her. When I walked back into the living room, I asked the family who was there. All of the previously listed family members were still seated in their respective couches and chairs when I walked back to the living room. At this point, I was under the impression that an elderly relative of my relatives had arrived while I was in the restroom. They all reassured me that we were the only ones in the house, and no one had come to visit after my parents and I. I doubled down, telling them that I just saw someone walk past the restroom door. I even described, probably crudely, the woman that I saw. My uncle immediately got up and began searching the house. He started in the back bedrooms and made his way back to the living room, thoroughly searching every nook and cranny along the way. There was no one else in the house. I kind of dropped it. It was weird, but it wasn't scary. I never once felt frightened. We moved on with the day, and that night I was able to sleep in my cousin's room with him. I'd never been in that room prior to this night. Once I walked in, I immediately noticed a picture hung on the wall. It was the woman I saw. She had the same hairstyle and the same glasses. She was the same size and had all the same features. I questioned him about this, and he told me that that was his grandmother, which I knew they had gotten this house from, but it never clicked in my head. She had died in the living room of old age. He told me his room was her room, and when his parents remodeled it for him, they left that picture up. At this point, I did get a little hesitant because he had a deer head mounted on the wall. I was a big fan of Evil Dead 2, and if I knew if ghostly shenanigans were afoot, that thing was going to maniacally laugh at some point in the night. It didn't, though. I slept soundly. Never saw or heard anything else. I've been to that house countless times and never seen or heard anything else either. I've never seen another apparition anywhere that I know of. So that's my rather unexplained event. I've told people I know countless times, but I've never really written it out in any way like this before. That's the end of tonight's stories. See you later.